All right, today we're diving deep into one of the most unbelievable corporate scandals you'll ever hear about, the total collapse of Enron. It's a wild story of greed, lies, and a corporate failure so huge it literally changed the rules of the game for everyone.
So, to really get a feel for how fast this giant fell, just look at these two numbers. In the middle of 2001, one share of Enron stock was flying high at over $90. But just a few months later, it was worth less than a quarter. We're talking a complete and total wipeout.
And this number? $74 billion.
That's how much shareholder money just, poof, evaporated in the years leading up to the end. This wasn't just a business failing. It was the life savings of thousands of employees and everyday investors going up in smoke.
And you've got to understand, the reason this was such a shock is that Enron wasn't some little startup. No way. This was the 7th largest company in the entire United States. They were an absolute titan, seen as this cutting-edge, innovative powerhouse.
And the speed of it all was just terrifying. This wasn't some slow, gradual decline. It was a nosedive. The company essentially went into a free fall over just a few weeks as everyone's confidence just vanished into thin air.
The end came so fast, like a cascade of dominoes. It all happened in about 120 days. First, the CEO suddenly quits for personal reasons, which is never a good sign. Then, boom, they report a massive loss. Next thing you know, the SEC is investigating. And then finally, bankruptcy, the biggest in American history at that point.
Which leads to the one question that was on everybody's mind. How is this even possible? How does a company that big, that powerful, just disappear?
Well, to find the answer, we have to pull back the curtain and look at how Enron was cooking its books. Turns out, this whole grand illusion was built on two really clever and deeply dishonest accounting tricks.
So the first ingredient in this recipe for disaster was something called mark-to-market accounting. Now, what this basically let Enron do was claim all the money they hoped to make from a deal in the future as profit today. It was the ultimate way of counting your chickens before they hatched, and it made them look wildly profitable, even when actual cash wasn't coming in the door.
And get this, the CEO, Jeff Skilling, pretty much admitted their finances were a black box, impossible for anyone on the outside to really understand. But then he'd turn right around and tell Wall Street, don't worry, you can trust them. I mean, that quote just says it all about the level of arrogance and secrecy going on.
Okay, the second trick was even sneakier. It was called a special purpose entity, or SPE. The best way to think of these is like a financial trapdoor. Enron created these empty shell companies for one reason: to hide all their massive debt and their failing projects. They just shuffle them off the main company's books, making them magically disappear from view.
And we're not just talking about a couple of these things. Enron created hundreds of them in this giant, complicated web of deception. And here's the real kicker. Their own chief financial officer, a guy named Andrew Fastow, was running many of them himself and getting rich off the side deals. A total unbelievable conflict of interest.
So you have to be asking yourself, where were the watchdogs in all this, right? A fraud this big can't happen in a vacuum. It means the gatekeepers, the people who were supposed to be protecting investors, completely failed.
And that brings us to Arthur Andersen. Now, at the time, these guys were one of the 5 biggest and most respected accounting firms in the entire world. They were the gold standard. Their whole job was to be the independent auditor, the trusted watchdog making sure Enron's books were clean.
But here is where it all went so wrong. Look at these numbers. Andersen was making more money from consulting for Enron than they were from their actual job of auditing them. So ask yourself, are you really going to be tough on your biggest client when they're paying you millions in side hustle money? The answer was a clear no. This massive conflict of interest just blew up their duty to the public. They didn't just sign off on the fake reports, they actually helped Enron design the shady deals. And when the whole house of cards started to fall, what did they do? They started shredding documents by the ton, which they were later convicted for. Just unbelievable.
The fallout from all this was just unprecedented. It didn't just sink Enron. It took down one of the biggest and most prestigious names in the entire world of finance right along with it.
And this just sent a terrifying question rippling through the entire industry. If you can't trust a firm like Arthur Andersen, one of the biggest on the planet, then who can you trust?
Well, the answer became known as the Andersen effect. All of the other big accounting firms saw what happened and, frankly, got scared to death. They realized that could have been us. So suddenly,
Everyone got way more careful, way more skeptical. The whole profession was basically forced to clean up its act.
And let's be clear, their reputation wasn't just tarnished, it was completely destroyed. A global company with 85,000 employees just ceased to exist. It's a stark, powerful reminder of what happens when the watchdogs fall asleep. Okay, so when you have a corporate implosion this spectacular, one that takes out its auditor too, Washington has to step in. This was a 5-alarm fire for the U.S. financial system, and Congress knew they had to do something big to stop it from ever happening again.
And the result was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. You'll almost always hear people just call it SOX. And this wasn't some tiny new regulation. It was a landmark piece of legislation that was designed to completely reshape corporate accountability in America.
The whole idea behind SOX was to slam the door on the loopholes that Enron had exploited. It meant executives had to personally sign off on their financial reports. No more, I didn't know. It created much tougher penalties for fraud, and, really important, it created a whole new board to police the auditors themselves.
Now, more than 20 years later, people still debate SOX. You've got critics who say it's just too expensive and complicated for companies to comply with. But its supporters will tell you that it's an absolutely essential law that protects investors and keeps our markets from becoming the Wild West.
Which really leaves us with one final big question. The Enron scandal gave us all these new laws, all these new rules. But did it actually change the underlying culture? Can a law ever really stop that kind of unchecked ambition and corporate greed? That's a question we're probably still grappling with today.